This is a story about a 40-year chess match where one side didn't even know it was playing. It's about how a bunch of seemingly smart business decisions added up to a massive national security crisis. And, well, it's about a bill that has finally come due. Let's dive in.
Let's just start with one number that tells you pretty much everything you need to know. 1 to 1,000. In 2023, for every single pound of uranium the U.S. managed to mine, its nuclear reactors burned through 1,000 pounds. A dependency ratio that stark? Well, that doesn't happen by accident. That is engineered.
So, how on earth did this happen? How does a global superpower find itself relying on geopolitical rivals for the very fuel that keeps 20% of its lights on? Well, the answer is a fascinating story of calculated strategy on one side versus calculated neglect on the other.
Today we're going to unpack two massive blunders. First, Russia's deliberate long-term strategy to corner the market. And second, the internal economic logic that led the United States to basically just stand by and watch it happen. And you'll see why the billions in emergency funding being thrown around today, it's really just a very, very late payment on a 40-year-old debt.
Okay, first let's look at Russia's game. To really get why the West lost, you have to realize they weren't just up against a typical competitor. They were playing against a predator.
I mean, just look at this. You've got Russia's state-owned Rosatom and China's CNC. You put them together, and they control over 60% of the world's uranium enrichment. That's not just market dominance, folks. That is a strategic chokehold on the entire global fuel supply.
And right here, this is the fundamental mismatch. A Western company has a legal duty, a fiduciary duty, to make as much profit as it can for its shareholders. Simple. But Rosatom's orders from the Kremlin? Totally different. Create geopolitical dependency. They're playing two completely different games on the very same board. One side is playing for profit, the other is playing for power.
So how do you play for power instead of profit? It's pretty easy, actually, when you have what amounts to an infinite cheat code. Rosatom inherited the entire massive enrichment infrastructure of the Soviet military for free. Their capital costs are literally zero. This lets them sell fuel at prices that aren't designed to make a profit. They're designed to eliminate all of their competition.
But here's the wild part of the story. Russia didn't just have to fight its way into the American market. For 20 years, the U.S. held the front door wide open and invited them right in. And they did it all in the name of peace.
It was called megatons to megawatts, and on the surface, it seemed like a perfect win-win. The idea was to take old Soviet warheads, downblend the weapons-grade uranium, and use it to generate clean power in America. And for 2 decades, it worked like a charm. At its peak, this single program supplied half of all the fuel for U.S. reactors. We were turning their swords into our plowshares. It felt like a massive triumph.
But while we were all celebrating this peace dividend, that flood of cheap Russian fuel was doing something absolutely devastating back home. It was making it impossible for American uranium mines to compete. In 1980, the U.S. was the world leader, producing nearly 44 million pounds of uranium. By the time that program ended in 2013, our production had completely collapsed, and a decade after that, it's pretty much zero. The peace program had become a Trojan horse, hollowing out our entire domestic industry from the inside out.
And this brings us to the second, and you could argue more important part of this story. Why did rational American companies, all acting in their own best interests, allow this national security disaster to unfold? The answer lies in a classic economic trap.
This is so important to understanding the logic here. For a nuclear power plant, the actual uranium they buy is only a tiny fraction of their total budget. We're talking about 14%. This creates a really strange incentive. Why would any single utility pay more for American-mined uranium to support national security when the savings from cheaper foreign fuel go straight to their bottom line? And that, my friends, is the textbook definition of the free rider problem. The public good here was a secure domestic fuel supply. Every nuclear plant in the country benefited from having it around, but no single plant had a strong enough financial reason to pay extra to maintain it. So everyone bought the cheaper foreign stuff, assuming someone else would keep the American industry alive. Of course, when everyone free rides, the public good just disappears.
And here is the killer irony. In the 1990s, the U.S. deregulated its electricity markets to create more competition. And hey, it worked. Plants got more efficient. But it also surgically removed the one and only mechanism that could have forced utilities to think about national security.
The old regulators were gone. Suddenly, being a free rider wasn't just the most rational choice, it was the only choice. So, what happens when you combine a foreign predator that has a geopolitical mandate and free infrastructure with a domestic market that's structurally designed to ignore long-term security? Well, over 40 years, the result was the complete decomposition of an entire American industry.
The numbers that came out of this 40-year process are just staggering. Operating mines went from over 250 down to about 5. Annual production, it dropped from almost 44 million pounds to just 50,000. And the workforce, which was 22,000 strong, is now just over 100 people. This isn't an industry in decline. This is an industry that has vanished.
Which brings us right to today. The long game is over. The free ride has ended, and now the bill for decades of ignoring this problem has finally arrived. And here is the cold, hard result of all of this. By 2023, 99% of the uranium used to fuel America's nuclear fleet was imported. The domestic industry wasn't just in trouble. For all practical purposes, it was gone. Now, to fix this, the U.S. is mobilizing $3.4 billion in emergency funding to try and rebuild this industry from scratch. But let's be crystal clear about what this money really is. It's not an investment. It's a late payment on a 40-year debt, a debt that we accrued while we were free-riding on a system that our rivals were systematically dismantling. So this leaves us with one final sobering question. Can you really buy back an industry in 5 years that it took 40 years to decay? The money is now on the table, sure, but the skills, the infrastructure, the knowledge, a lot of that is gone. The chess match didn't stop just because America finally looked down at the board. The only thing that changed is that now we have to pay for all the moves we never made.